Hello everybody and welcome to my presentation. For my secret project, I received Miss Grace Lee Boggs. We start off with a quote, "Evolution is not linear, times interact." I wanted to start off with this particular quote because I think it serves a great introduction to the mind of Grace. As Grace said herself, photographs are just a snapshot of who we were at one time in time. Grace was born in 1915 and was alive exactly 100 years. Yes, an entire century. Imagine all that she encountered over those years. Born in Rhode Island, the Chinese American is best known as a philosopher, civil rights activist for the Black Power movement, and an extraordinary writer of her time. The majority of the information I'm presenting I found on pbs.org or in her documentary that can be found on Netflix called American Revolutionary, The Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs. Like Tracy forewarned me, it was easy to get lost in her weeds. She was an activist for this and for that. She was Chinese, but did more for the Black Power movement than most Black people did. Was a radical at one point, but then chose change over anger. Preached Malcolm's word, but lived by King's. It was a lot to take in, but over the course of this presentation, I hope that I can break it down in an organized fashion. Now, I've broken this presentation up into two parts. First, Grace's journey, and second, the philosophers and activists that she looked up to. She lived a comfortable life for the most part as a younger child. Her family, being business owners, they thrived, and she never really saw anyone out of her community, let's put it that way. She went off to college and graduated from Barnard College in 1940. She then found herself in Chicago, where she was having a difficult time getting a job because nobody hired Orientals. Now living amongst the Black community, what really got Grace going was the March on Washington movement, which demanded jobs for Blacks. Roosevelt had no other choice and signed an order against discrimination of Blacks in the workplace.
I found out that if you mobilize a mass action, you can change the world. And I thought to myself, boy, if a movement can achieve that, that's what I want to do with my life.
During her first few years in Chicago, Grace met C.R.L. James, who she worked closely with for the next decade. Together they developed new ideas and studied Marxist theory. In the later 1950s, Grace separated from this movement to focus more on the American Revolution as she saw it, this revolution that was emerging from the Black community. During this time, she took on party leadership alongside C.R.L. James in a party called Socialist Workers' Party. Here's where it starts to get a little radical. Grace has a huge FBI record stacked up against her. She's been accused of everything as far as a communist, but this was normal back then. Now remember, the movement was shaped around jobs, and politics at the time said Detroit is where the workers are, and that's where you need to be. Now, bear with me, we're still in 1950s, but once Grace got to Detroit, she worked for the Correspondence newspaper, a newspaper that was really directed towards minorities and women. This is where she met James Boggs, her future husband of 40 years. He was a Black man, and people would give her a hard time that she just didn't understand what it was like to be married to a Black man. James, who went by Jimmy, is an important piece to the Grace puzzle. He moved to Detroit in the 1930s to work on the line at Chrysler and watched the line start to shrink after World War II. Being Black and experiencing the loss of Black jobs firsthand gave Grace a different point of view that she had never experienced herself. He was a creative thinker of new ideas and encouraged Grace to push her mind to the limit and do the same. She gravitated to him, obviously.
Let's view the question of change that has to take place in society not as something that just somebody ought to do just because they don't like what's going on, but because what is going on is making us a less of a human being every day.
This is where I started to fall for Grace, because here's where she started to walk the walk and make that self-change within herself. She believed that we don't choose the time that we live in, but we do choose who we want to be, and we do choose how we want to think. And that's so powerful to me. Once again, Grace decides to separate herself from the Marxist movement and dives straight into the Black Power movement. This is where her mind starts to change with the times. It wasn't just about Black jobs and Black rights anymore. It was deeper than that. It was about a revolution. She was inspired and began speaking publicly about the Black Revolution. She became so involved that she actually organized Martin Luther King's most famous speech given in Detroit. In the late 1960s, the revolution was gaining speed faster than ever before. And Jimmy and other activists were so overwhelmed with the violence happening to specifically Blacks, they would speak out with so much conviction and almost encourage violence from their side as well. Now you have to think of this. This is something that Jimmy and Grace had been talking about for more than a decade. And now it's this radical Black protest. And what it needed was a shift with new ideas. And with those ideas needed to come action. So from this, Grace helped start an all-Black political party called the Freedom Now Party. And the interesting part is she was the only non-Black member of this party. Now, their goal was to bring about power for the Black community. Now, Grace lived to be 100, so I can't go through her entire life step by step. However, I do want to focus in on Detroit in the summer of 1967. This was probably the peak of the revolution, because from this came a rebellion, and they called it the rebellion. And with that came riots. And it was at this point that Grace had another realization. She said it herself: we have to change ourselves in order to change the world. And that we have a responsibility for evolution of the human species. So it was at this point that she realized violence was not the way to go. Yes, everybody was angry and upset, and so much has built up to this point, but where are we going from here? How are we changing ourselves to get to the next point? And from here, Grace really leads the rest of her life encouraging people and motivating people. Grace loved Detroit so much, and she was so passionate about it, that until the day she died, she felt responsible for it. And now I'm going to switch over to the philosophers and activists that Grace idolized over the course of her life. The first two you see here are George Hegel and Karl Marx. And these are philosophers that have been around for centuries. And these are also philosophers that Grace really dug into and studied at a young age. And the last two here are Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. And these are the civil rights activists during the civil rights era that had a lot to do with the movement itself. So obviously Grace looked to them for answers. So as we go through these next couple of slides, try to break down the time in which Grace felt that these philosophers were relevant in her life. It's pretty interesting. So do you remember back when Grace decided to drop all her classes and go into philosophy? This is the philosopher, Mr. Hegel, who really changed her mind and opened her mind completely. His idea was stated as followed: every idea contains its opposite, and by struggling through those contradictions, one can get closer to the truth. Basically, don't get stuck in an old idea. As reality changes, so do your ideas. And isn't it funny how Grace's story developed? Her ideas had to develop as time went on. Next, we have Mr. Karl Marx. And before I go into detail when she found him relevant, let's read his idea. projects socialism as worker power, whereby the workers take over the state, sweep away the existing society with a new society by mass action. Now, this is where it can get a little bit more radical, because essentially what he's saying is if the masses are angry enough, then they can sweep away the existing society, and from this will emerge a new society. Now, I can think of 2 different times in her life that I showed you that this is relevant. Obviously, when she joined the CJL's group for Marxism, and probably right there at the end when the revolution was becoming the rebellion and the riots started. Moving right along in Grace's life, we come across Malcolm X. And, he came about in the civil rights era and was a huge human and civil rights activist. Now, his ideas were as followed. The black people are the original people of the world, and the white people are the devils, and they deserve so much more than acceptance. Now, you're probably thinking the same thing I am. He's so passionate about his beliefs, and, some of what he's saying is true, and they do deserve so much more. But again, around the same time as when these riots started, you had activists who came forward, like Malcolm X, and their speeches would come off so aggressive that they would almost encourage violence. Now, as we shift to Martin Luther King Jr., just as Grace did over the course of her life, who obviously outstanding guy, was a minister, also a civil rights activist in the civil rights era. See, now his ideas were built out of love, and here are just some of the few notes that I took from his philosophy, and it all revolves around nonviolence. Nonviolence is the way of life. Nonviolence seeks to win friendships and understanding. Nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. So I hope that you enjoy this presentation and you can take it for what it is. Obviously, there's so much more of her life that I wasn't able to get to, but I just want to say thank you to Miss Grace Lee Boggs for opening my eyes a little bit more to philosophy. It's so easy just to say that ideas matter, but there are times when expanding our imaginations is what is required to change ourselves, to change the world.